Well, I would first of all like to welcome you back. Janette, you are, this is your second time on the Sharpen podcast. And so it's so fun to have you back. First of all, welcome.
Thanks, Kirby. It's great to be here, as always.
Yes. Well, any excuse to get some time with you too. Like, tricks on you. I'm actually not even airing this podcast. It was just a way to get some time on your calendar with you. So,
I'm okay with that, actually.
Okay, great. We'll just keep going then, and maybe it'll end up on the podcast. But for those of you, or for those that are listening that didn't get to listen to your last episode, please go back. We will link that in show notes today. But Janette came on and talked about risk, adversity, experiences of that she has had kind of in that startup space. She is such a gifted person. And I'd love for you to go back and listen to that episode if you haven't today. But for those that are listening that are meeting you for the first time, tell us about who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Kirby. So, I live in San Francisco. I lead sales and marketing for a startup, software startup. We work across food and ag, and I actually am a recent transplant to the Bay Area. So I actually grew up on a farm in Southeast Arizona. So this is a pretty big, really a lot. Pick your dimension along every single dimension. It's a pretty big jump for the farm kid from Cochise, Arizona.
What's the biggest one so far?
Oh, I mean, we could go down the list. I mean, a fairly innocuous difference is just that when I walk out my apartment building, I turn and I can see the bay. And as someone who has always lived in landlocked states, that's a fun little difference there. So
for sure.
Yeah. So San Francisco, doing the startup thing, really enjoying this startup space and just this whole concept of growing businesses. But really my background and kind of my first love is in food and agriculture. So like I said, grew up on a farm, then got into the ag industry, and really kind of moved through some different agribusinesses. And that was kind of in a roundabout way how I got into the startup space, where I'm really interested in companies that are solving food and ag problems and using new technology or new applications of older technology to solve those problems. So that's me.
I love it. We talk a little bit about that in the last episode from some of the work that you've been a part of. I think that was actually as you were starting this current role, was right around the time we recorded that. So that's I encourage folks to we kind of dive back into like the historical of like, why do you care so much about that industry and what's some of the work that you've done. So we are so excited to have you on as we continue in our Enneagram series. And before we started here this morning, we were catching up of just learnings about the Enneagram. And so it's been so neat, Janette, as we've talked about the framework. It is another tool in the toolbox. It is not it's not the Swiss Army knife of it's everything to it's all the tools that you need. But before we talk a little bit more about some of the learnings of just the framework, tell us about I wrote down earlier, you're going to laugh. The title for your episode needs to be "Don't Put Me in a Box." We're not sure. Like, you identify with two kind of different types. So tell us about what you know about those types, and maybe some of those things you're like, I resonate with this of that type. What do we need to know about a type 6 and a type 8?
Yeah. So I'll just kind of back up and say this, that for the longest time, I had heard people talk about the Enneagram, and I was always like, I am not getting into that because those people are a cult and then it's all they talk about. So I had really resisted for a long time, even though I'd heard a lot of people talking about it. And then I finally picked up a book. It's called The Road Back to You. I'm going to say it was like last fall 2018. And once I started reading it, I just really got hooked on it. It's such a fascinating framework to think about, not just the behaviors that we all have, but why we have those behaviors, right? Yeah. And so it's a different level of depth and a different level of nuance than any other I don't want to use the phrase personality assessment because
Sure.
that's not what it is, but in that bucket of frameworks that help you better understand people, I just think it's more nuanced than most of them are. So I really appreciate that about the Enneagram. So as you said, don't know what number I am, even though I've now read like 3 books. I listen to 3 podcasts religiously about the Enneagram. But it's funny because I talk to a lot of people who say that as they're reading, like the first thing about the 9 types, they just immediately latch on to, oh my gosh, that's me. This is my number. And it just immediately resonates with them. And that hasn't necessarily been my experience. So there are pieces of different numbers that I have that experience with. But there's not one that I'm like, oh, this is my core number. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so like you said, I mean, I've kind of gone back and forth between identifying with the 6 and with the 8. The issue is that, so I'll kind of lay this component out. With the 8, what resonates with me is it talks about like the need for intensity of experiences, which, there's a reason I really enjoy Startup World. It's super intense, right? And there's a lot of unique risk and challenges that you take on. And I love that about it, right? So I think that aspect of the 8 resonates with me. What doesn't resonate is this idea of just this idea of like an extraordinary level of confidence that, borders on the negative end of that at certain health ranges. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that's me. But then when I look at the 6, and so the 6 is a little bit more about, they're much more aware of uncertainty and trying to compensate for areas of uncertainty. The thing about the 6, as I've learned more about it, that makes me think potentially that's my number, is that there's kind of 2 types of 6s, right? There's the 6 that the fear that they experience drives them to run from things that induce fear, right? Then there's 6s that are called counterphobic 6s. What they do is they see fear and they just rebel against it. And so they see fear and they just run right at it, right? Yeah. Which causes them to have some 8-like tendencies. One of the issues is that because the first type of 6 is the most common, that's what everyone talks about. So it's really hard to find information about the counterphobic 6 in the first place. So I think maybe that's one reason also that I'm still a little bit unsure of where I lie on that. But then either way, I for sure have some 7 wing in there, causing some counteractions as well. So that all gets a little bit wrapped up together. Point. So
okay.
There's definitely like a range. Yeah. So that's kind of where I've been. But it is just interesting listening to different people talk about their views on those different numbers, because you kind of pull different insights out of each person's perspective. So.
Yeah. Well, Drew Mosier opened us up and he talked about, the 6 is often called the loyalist. I think I heard on Ian Crone's typology podcast that 6 is the most common type that he finds in most demographics. And then the 8 is known as the challenger. So you're right. There can be some similarities between the 2. It sounds like you identify with both. So you kind of shared some of those today, but as you think about, other young professionals that are listening today, whether they're 6 or 8, I love that you said that the framework can be helpful, no matter what. So what would you say if you're listening and you kind of identified with one of the segments or both that they were listening to you share today? I mean, how are you using the framework in the workplace, outside of the workplace, in relationships? What does that look like for you using it, like for work for Janette? And then how are you using it as you work with other people?
Yeah, great question. So I guess first of all, stepping back from what number you are, which is almost irrelevant, right? In the context of this conversation about how you use the Enneagram.
Yeah.
What I think the most valuable aspect of the Enneagram is that it's a conversation starter, right? So it gives me a framework that I can then have conversations with people who know me well, and have that conversation of A, B, and C are some things I'm reading. as someone who knows me well, but isn't inside my head, how do you see me living these things out? Or do you, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the conversation that it facilitates. It's the self-reflection that it drives. I think it's more of the process. And again, just as a young professional, as you're trying to figure out what type of leader you want to be, and what types of relationships in the workplace that you want to foster, all of those types of things. I think this framework can be really helpful as you're trying to understand that. And both as you're trying to understand where I am today versus where I want to be in 10 years or in 40 years, and what you want people to say about your leadership brand. I think the Enneagram can be really helpful in that, and figuring out, how you want to foster relationships, and how you want to use different aspects around your leadership style. So I think that's one thing, is just in the process that it drives and the benefits of that process. To the second thing then, around how I use it in the workplace. So, and this is, you and I were chatting about this before we started recording, but so my kind of caveat on anything along the lines of the Enneagram is that everybody has to be really mature about it, right? Mm-hmm. Because the risk is that the individual says, this is who I am, and uses the Enneagram as justification for maybe less than good behaviors, right? Or as justification for certain ways of dealing with life. But then the alternate risk is how we use it with others. And that when we find out, oh, that person's an 8, we just immediately jump to making assumptions about the negative side of that number, right? Whether that's a 1 or an 8 or a whomever. And so I think if we can call out the risk of how we use it with others, then that kind of sets us up to be able to use it more intentionally, a little bit more positively. And it's definitely something that, I think with the Enneagram, one of the benefits of it as well is that it can be really hard to identify what number other people are, right? Like,
you should never do that, by the way.
Yeah. And because
don't type others.
Yeah. Because it's so driven by, what we're motivated by, as opposed to our behaviors. And so I think, because of that benefit, that it does not lend itself to typing others, that's a positive aspect about it. But that's also a reason why, if, in terms of using it in the workplace, there are times where I can see certain, it's like the portfolio of behaviors, right? That sometimes can add up and point towards a number. Not that you're sure if that's their number by any means. But sometimes I can kind of connect that portfolio of behaviors and then connect that back with things I've read about certain numbers, and have a little bit of extra grace for if that's what's driving those behaviors. That means I need to do something different in terms of how I'm connecting with them, because that might be driven by this concern that they have, right? Or this, underlying fear that they have about the world. So I think that's a helpful thing, but more than anything, I think it's about kind of those specific things that I can pull out from the numbers. Most people they don't know the Enneagram, right? So instead of talking in terms of numbers, I think it's instead pulling out certain behaviors or motivators or that type of thing, and using that as the basis of the conversation, whether that's with, your direct reports or peers or your boss or, anybody that you're working with.
Yeah, no, that's so good, Janette. And I think that you call out a couple important things of, like, number one, whatever your type is, using the framework. I've heard this said before with the Enneagram, and this is the reason I really prefer it in terms of personality assessments, is that you have to do the work then. Like, you don't just get to say,
right,
I'm a type 3 and therefore it means this, and you guys just have to deal with it. It actually now gives you some language and metrics and just to be able to do the work. And then, like you said, those close to you to be able to kind of help you in that process too. So individually, whatever the type is, it's a framework that's moving in the direction of health, versus really, as you start to dive into the Enneagram, you kind of read it and you're like, oh, like this is pretty unhealthy. Like sometimes my greatest thing can be my like really not great thing. Janette, you mentioned that you read The Road Back to You. You had used some different resources to dive into it a little bit more, podcasts, et cetera. So what are your favorites so far? What are your go-tos for this framework?
Yeah. So, okay. So I think The Road Back to You is a great place to start,
Yeah.
if nothing else, because it's one of the only books of its type that's written with an element of humor, which just makes it fun to read and get started. So that's a great starting point. From there, because I was in this place of, I'm not exactly sure which number I am. I need more detail. So I went to a book called The Wisdom of the Enneagram, and that one's kind of intense. So it's much more, instead of like reading it cover to cover like I did with The Road Back to You, that one I jumped much more, just went straight to the numbers that I was trying to understand specifically. And it just had a much greater level of detail around each of them. So that was really helpful. And then as far as podcasts, so there's a podcast, has any of your guests mentioned Sleeping at Last?
Oh, no one has, but I've had friends that have told me about this.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, let's just call it's a weird title for a podcast.
For sure. Can you tell me about the name?
I don't understand the name of it. I mean,
I've not listened for the name alone. Thanks for bringing it up.
So it's okay. First of all, also as either a counterphobic 6 or an 8, this is not something that I would normally listen to. But basically it's where, so the guy who does the podcast, he writes these songs, which he writes a song about every single Enneagram type. And then he has guests on that kind of help him unpack each of them. Right. And so, the song is written kind of to speak to like the core motivators of every single type, which is why it's interesting. Cause it's a much more like creative, artistic, like a different level of abstraction about the Enneagram almost. So I found it just interesting from that angle. And that was probably the most information that I've heard about this idea of the counterphobic 6. So they just went into just another level of nuance around the Enneagram, which was good. So that's a great one. And then one that I follow on Instagram, it's a lady, her handle is Your Enneagram Coach. And she puts up a lot of great stuff on Instagram. And then one that you helped me find, which is more humorous than anything, is Enneagram and Coffee.
For sure.
So I just love that. Like every time I see these lists she puts out of, which Harry Potter character is each number, things like that, or how does each type tend to handle a first date, or, just funny things like that. She's an enjoyable follow. So those are kind of some of the resources. Oh, and then Susan Stabile, her podcast that she does. That's of course a really good resource. So yeah, those are some of the resources that I enjoy following to learn a little bit more about the Enneagram.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. Yeah. I love all of the in-depth resources between the books and the podcasts that you mentioned, but the Enneagram and Coffee, I think it just is helpful perspective too, but it also I think sometimes we've got to learn to lighten up around, because sometimes, as you mentioned earlier, that Enneagram conversation, it's like, whoa, don't type other people, don't put this box and then throw them in that. But the Enneagram and Coffee can make that just more I don't know, a little bit more relaxed. And if we can have a little fun with the conversation and we're missing out.
Yeah, exactly. And just that idea that, with these lists that she does, it's almost, she makes every Enneagram number sound cool, right?
Right. Exactly.
So I think that's part of why that's a fun thing, is because she makes them all sound like people you'd want to hang out with.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. Janette, I shared with you earlier that we were sharing game changers, of course, at the end of every episode. And you may or may not have time to have thought of one, but I was like, what's the most stereotypical type 6 and type 8 game changer? If you haven't, that's fine, but we'd love to hear one from you. We've had some really funny ones that have come about.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay. So I don't know that I don't know that I have a stereotypical one.
That's fair.
I mean, if we hadn't just had a conversation about the Enneagram and someone off the street asked me about a game changer, I would have said the Enneagram, but I feel like that answer is off limits now. Kind of gotten to the punchline on that one. No, okay. So I was talking about this with someone yesterday, just in the realm of great ideas for young professionals. I was talking about this with someone yesterday that a mentor of mine had asked me the question of, who are the 3 people that you need to meet and build a relationship with this year? And
that's good.
Like, so his point was, you need to have that list and you need to then start figuring out ways, how are you going to make that happen? Whether that's an introduction that you need to get there, whether you're just going to reach out on LinkedIn, what that's going to look like. So I think that's just a great actionable idea for young professionals.
Yeah, I love that. The book Never Eat Alone even talks to that strategically about building those plans of those, like fostering and cultivating existing relationships and the ones of the future.
Right.
Like it's usually most time not this like serendipity type moment of, oh, we were just on an elevator and connected and then this. I mean, those things sometimes happen, but majority of time, no, it's more intentional. That's good.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us. I love that you're speaking to this like experience of, I didn't land on one type. Here's kind of like the 2 that really seem similar for me. And that's okay. As long as you're using the framework to a place of like health, greater empathy, understanding others better than, like, that's the goal, right?
Absolutely.